The funeral was a cold, silent affair. The gray skies above seemed to mirror the heavy sorrow that weighed down on the mourners gathered at the cemetery. It was a place that felt like the edge of the world, where life and death seemed to intersect in a permanent, immutable way. For most people, a funeral was a time for reflection, to say goodbye, to offer a final farewell. But for Daniel, it was something far more painful. As he stood at the edge of the crowd, hidden beneath the shadow of a nearby oak tree, his heart pounded in his chest. His eyes were fixed on the coffin being lowered into the earth, but his mind wasn't really there. His thoughts were somewhere else, drifting, caught in a storm of emotions that seemed too vast to contain. This was supposed to be a moment of peace for him. After all, the man in that coffin was his stepfather, the one who had raised him after his parents had tragically passed away in a car accident when Daniel was just a child. But instead of feeling any sense of closure, Daniel was overwhelmed by confusion and a deep sense of betrayal. He had been invited to the funeral, of course. It would have been unthinkable for the family to exclude him. After all, he was part of it, wasn't he? He had lived under the same roof as his stepfather for years. Yet, ever since the accident that took his mother and father, Daniel had always felt like an outsider. His stepfather's children, his stepsiblings, had never fully accepted him into the fold. He had always been that other person. The orphan. The one who didn't really belong. As the final prayers were recited and the last handfuls of dirt were thrown onto the casket, Daniel stood there, feeling like he was fading into the background of the scene, a mere blur in the corner of a painting he could never quite be a part of. Then, suddenly, two figures approached. The man and woman walked toward him with deliberate steps, their faces unreadable. The sun behind them cast long shadows, making them seem like giants towering over him. Daniel's pulse quickened as they drew closer, his breath catching in his throat. He knew who they were, his stepbrother, Mark, and stepsister, Emily. They were the children of his stepfather, and despite having shared a home with them for years, they never made him feel like family. Mark, the older of the two, stopped in front of him. His face was a mask of calm, but his eyes held a hardness that sent a chill through Daniel's spine. Emily stood beside him, her lips pressed together in a tight, unforgiving line. "You're still here?" Mark's voice was low, almost a growl, as he looked at Daniel. "I thought you'd leave with the others." Daniel blinked, taken aback. "What do you mean?" "You don't belong here," Mark said flatly, as though stating the most obvious fact in the world. "This is a family matter. You're not a part of this family. You shouldn't be here." The words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. This wasn't just some harsh comment. This was an expulsion, a rejection so complete that it left no room for doubt. He opened his mouth to speak, to try and defend himself, but nothing came out. His thoughts scrambled, his voice caught in his throat. For a moment it felt like the world had paused, the sound of the wind and the distant murmurs of the other mourners fading into nothing. Emily, the younger sister, stepped forward. Her eyes were sharp, her face cold and unfeeling. "Just leave," she said, her voice a quiet command, barely a whisper against the wind. "You've already taken enough from us. It's time to go." Daniel couldn't process what was happening. This wasn't the funeral he had imagined. He had never expected a grand display of affection from his stepfamily, but this? This felt like a betrayal so deep it was incomprehensible. He glanced around at the other mourners, hoping someone, anyone, would come to his defense. But no one did. They stood in small groups, talking in hushed tones, oblivious to the scene unfolding before them. It was as if he was invisible to them, just another piece of the landscape, someone who wasn't really supposed to be there. His eyes flicked back to Mark and Emily, their faces now more expressions of judgment than anything else. There was no mercy in their eyes. There was no empathy. It was like they had decided that he didn't matter anymore. I don't understand," Daniel stammered, his voice breaking as he finally found his words. "He was my father. He raised me. I belong here." His voice cracked with the weight of the years he had spent living under the same roof, trying to prove that he was more than just the orphan who had been taken in out of obligation. "You never belonged," Mark said, his voice colder than the wind. "You were never really part of this family. You were a charity case. Don't forget that." Daniel's breath caught in his chest. The words felt like daggers, each one cutting deeper than the last. He could feel his chest tightening, his vision blurring as the sting of their rejection overwhelmed him. "Leave," Emily repeated, her voice now firm, unwavering. "We don't want you here." In that moment, something inside Daniel snapped. It wasn't just the rejection that hurt, it was the realization that his entire life had been built on a lie. He had believed, for so many years, that he had a place in this world. That his stepfather, the man who had given him a roof over his head and food in his stomach after he lost everything, had truly accepted him. But now, standing here, facing the cold, unfeeling words of his step-siblings, Daniel realized that he had been nothing more than a convenience. His presence had never mattered. He had been a temporary fixture in their lives, a charity case, and nothing more. He turned away, unable to stand there any longer. The tears that he had kept bottled up for so long threatened to spill, but he couldn't bring himself to cry in front of them. Instead, he walked away, his heart heavy with the weight of everything he had just lost. His feet carried him down the long, winding path that led away from the cemetery. He didn't look back. The wind tugged at his coat, but he didn't feel the cold. The world around him seemed distant, like a dream that was slowly slipping away. All he could hear was the pounding of his own heart in his chest, and the rush of blood in his ears. He could feel the bitterness rising in his throat, but there was no one to talk to, no one to help him make sense of the pain that was gnawing at his insides. The road stretched out before him, long and lonely, like the rest of his life. He wasn't sure where he was going, but he couldn't stay there. Not after what had just happened. He had to get away. He needed time to think, to process everything that had just transpired. As he walked, Daniel couldn't help but wonder, what was the point of all of this? Was this his fate? To be forever cast aside, an unwanted stranger in the world he once thought he could call home? But then, as his thoughts swirled with confusion and pain, something caught his attention, a strange feeling in the pit of his stomach. It wasn't just the anger or sadness. It was something else. Something deeper. Something that felt like the beginning of a change. And though he didn't know it yet, that feeling would become the spark that ignited a chain of events that would lead him into a journey that would change everything. Daniel's footsteps seemed to echo in the vast, open emptiness of the road. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if he were carrying not just his body, but the weight of his entire life. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the empty streets, the kind of light that makes the world feel both beautiful and melancholic at the same time. The chill of the wind bit into his skin, but it barely registered. His mind was elsewhere, lost in a whirlwind of confusion, anger, and hurt. How had he gotten here? The words of his step-sibling still rang in his ears, mocking him, cutting through his thoughts. "You don't belong here. You were never part of this family. You were a charity case." Each sentence felt like a blade, carving deep into the part of him that had once believed there was a place for him in this world. But those words weren't just the voices of Mark and Emily. They were the voices of years of rejection, the ghosts of every moment when Daniel had been made to feel like he was never enough. His parents' deaths, his stepfather's seeming indifference, the way his step-siblings never acknowledged him as anything more than an outsider, it all culminated in that moment at the cemetery. But the question that haunted him now, more than any other, was, what now? He was alone. Completely alone. The world seemed like a vast, uninviting place, stretching endlessly ahead of him with no clear direction. His feet carried him forward, but his mind was a storm, full of swirling thoughts, each one more confusing than the last. He had to do something. Anything. He had been kicked out of his own stepfather's funeral. That was a humiliation, a wound that would take time to heal, if it ever healed at all. But Daniel wasn't the type to wallow. He had learned that much from his early years as an orphan. Life hadn't been kind to him, but it hadn't killed him either. He had always found a way to survive, even when the odds were stacked against him. As he walked aimlessly, the city around him began to feel more and more unfamiliar. He hadn't lived in this town long after his stepfather's death, and now it felt like a place he didn't belong. It was as if the very air had turned against him, carrying with it the bitter sting of rejection. Eventually, the road began to narrow, and the buildings around him became sparse. He found himself walking through a part of the town he didn't recognize, a quiet, almost abandoned area. The streets were empty, save for a few stray dogs sniffing around. The atmosphere was eerily silent, the kind of quiet that made Daniel's skin crawl. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for him to make a decision. And then, he saw it. A small cafe tucked between two dilapidated buildings. The sign was faded, the letters barely legible, but the warmth of the light shining from inside felt like an invitation. Daniel's stomach growled, reminding him of the hunger he hadn't paid attention to during the tumult of the day. Without thinking, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The cafe was a small, cozy place, with a few tables scattered around and the smell of fresh coffee and baked goods in the air. It was the kind of place that felt like it belonged in a different time, a place that was simple and unpretentious. There was something comforting about it, like a little island of calm in the middle of a storm. Behind the counter stood an older woman with a kind face, her gray hair pulled back into a neat bun. She looked up as Daniel entered, her eyes softening as she took in his disheveled appearance. "Hello there," she said, her voice warm and inviting. "What can I get for you?" Daniel hesitated, his mind still reeling from everything that had just happened. He didn't know what he needed, what he wanted. But something about the woman's presence, her calmness, made him feel like he didn't have to figure everything out just yet. "A coffee," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "And something to eat, if you have it." The woman nodded and began preparing his order. Daniel took a seat at one of the tables by the window, his eyes scanning the room as he tried to collect his thoughts. The walls were decorated with old photographs and paintings, giving the place a sense of history. It felt like it had been there for generations, holding on to memories while the rest of the world moved on. A few minutes later, the woman brought over a steaming cup of coffee and a plate with a warm pastry. Daniel looked at her, offering a small smile of thanks. She simply nodded and left him to his thoughts, returning to her work behind the counter. As he took a sip of the coffee, the warmth spread through him, grounding him in a way that he hadn't felt all day. The chaos of the funeral, the harsh words, the loneliness, all of it seemed to fade for a moment as he savored the simple comfort of the drink. The pastry was light and flaky, and he found himself eating it slowly, savoring the moment of peace it brought. But even as the warmth of the cafe surrounded him, his mind kept drifting back to the cemetery. To his stepfather's funeral. To the cold, heartless way he had been dismissed from what should have been his own moment of closure. The anger began to rise in his chest again. Why had they treated him like that? Why had they thrown him aside as if he were nothing? He knew it wasn't just about the funeral. It was about something deeper, something that had been building for years. His entire life had been defined by his status as an orphan. He had been taken in, yes, but always with the understanding that he was a burden. He had never been fully accepted by anyone, not by his stepfather, not by his step-siblings, and certainly not by the wider world. Daniel closed his eyes, trying to push the thoughts away. He couldn't let himself get lost in that anger. He had to figure out what came next. He had to keep moving forward, even if he didn't know where that path led. As he sat there, lost in thought, he noticed something strange. A man was sitting at the table across from him, watching him intently. Daniel looked up, startled, and met the man's gaze. The man was older, perhaps in his late 50s, with graying hair and a lined face that spoke of years of hard work. He wore a simple brown jacket and a worn hat, and his eyes were sharp, studying Daniel with an intensity that made him uneasy. "Are you all right, son?" the man asked, his voice low and gravelly. Daniel was caught off guard by the question. He wasn't used to people asking about him, not like this. He had always been the one to keep to himself, to hide his emotions behind a wall. But something about the man's tone made him feel like he didn't have to pretend anymore. I'm not sure," Daniel replied honestly. "Everything's just a lot right now." The man nodded, his gaze softening. "I understand. Life has a way of hitting you when you least expect it. But you can't let it break you. You've got to keep going." Daniel wasn't sure why, but the man's words resonated with him. Something about the way he spoke, as though he had lived through his own struggles, made Daniel feel like maybe he wasn't as alone as he thought. "I'll figure it out," Daniel said, though he wasn't sure if he believed his own words. "I just don't know where to go from here." The man gave him a small smile. "That's the thing, isn't it? You don't always know where you're going, but you've got to keep moving forward. Trust me, the road ahead will show you more than you expect. Just don't stop walking." Daniel looked at the man, his mind churning with the weight of his words. What if he was right? What if this was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment that would push him to make a change? He had spent so long being passive, letting life happen to him. Maybe it was time to take control. "Thanks," Daniel said quietly, not entirely sure what he was thanking him for, but feeling a strange sense of gratitude all the same. The man nodded, his eyes twinkling with some unspoken understanding. "Good luck, son. And remember, the road's never as long as it seems." With that, the man stood up, leaving a few bills on the table for his coffee. He gave Daniel one last glance before walking out of the cafe, disappearing into the quiet streets. For the first time that day, Daniel felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he didn't have all the answers, but the road ahead was still there, waiting for him. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he had thought. Daniel walked for hours. His steps were mechanical, driven by the need to put distance between himself and the nightmare that had unfolded earlier that day. The world around him seemed to blur, every face passing by an indistinct blur, a figure in a crowd he couldn't connect with. Even as the sun dipped lower, casting the town in hues of orange and purple, Daniel didn't stop. He didn't know where he was going, he didn't care. It was all just noise, just a world that kept spinning even when he felt like his own life had come to a screeching halt. He found himself at the edge of town, where the last remnants of civilization faded into open fields. The buildings thinned out, replaced by a stretch of grass and dirt. He paused, breathing heavily, looking out at the vast expanse before him. There were no answers here, no explanations. Just the endless sky and the quiet murmur of wine through the tall grass. Daniel's chest tightened again, and for a moment, he felt like he might collapse. Everything inside of him seemed to want to break. But he couldn't, he wouldn't, let himself. Not here. Not like this. Suddenly, a noise snapped him from his thoughts. A sharp sound, like the crunching of tires on gravel. He turned, his heart jumping into his throat as he saw a car pull up on the narrow road behind him. It was an old, beat-up station wagon, dusty and dented, the kind of car you'd expect to find in an abandoned parking lot or parked on a forgotten street. The car stopped, the engine rattling to a halt. The door opened, and a woman stepped out. She was older than Daniel, probably in her late 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. She was dressed simply, jeans, boots, and a leather jacket that looked worn from years of use. Her eyes, however, were the most striking feature about her. They were sharp, intense, as though they had seen things that most people couldn't imagine. The kind of eyes that made you feel like she could see right through you, like she knew exactly what you were going through. She studied him for a moment before speaking. Lost? Daniel blinked, caught off guard by the question. He wasn't used to being approached by strangers, especially not strangers who seemed so intent. He hesitated, unsure of what to say. Was he lost? Physically, no. But mentally, emotionally, he felt more lost than he ever had in his life. I suppose you could say that, he replied, his voice quieter than he intended. I guess I'm just walking. The woman nodded, as though she understood. Sometimes, walking's the best thing you can do when you don't know where you're headed. There was something in her voice, something grounded and familiar, like she'd been in his shoes before. For a moment, Daniel didn't say anything. He just stood there, unsure if he wanted to engage, if he wanted to let another stranger into the small, fragile world he was desperately trying to hold together. The woman looked at him for a moment longer, as if assessing something. Then, without another word, she motioned toward the car. Well, she said, you're welcome to come with me. I'm headed out of town, and I'm sure you could use a ride. Daniel hesitated again. Something in the way she spoke, the way her presence seemed to settle into the space around him, made him feel like he wasn't as alone as he had thought. She wasn't offering anything grand, no promises of answers or solace. Just a ride. Just a moment of connection. It was tempting. More tempting than he'd care to admit. Where are you going? Daniel asked, though it was almost rhetorical. What did it matter? He wasn't sure he cared, as long as he was away from here. Away from the pain. Does it matter? She asked with a wry smile. You're not going to find what you're looking for by standing still. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching her face, looking for something he couldn't quite place. The weight of the day, of the rejection, of the funeral, still hung heavy on his heart, but something about the woman made him feel like maybe he could keep moving. Maybe she had some kind of answer. All right, he said quietly. I'll come with you. She nodded, as though she had expected him to say yes, and turned toward the car. Daniel followed, the dust from the road kicking up beneath his feet as he climbed into the passenger seat. The interior of the car smelled like old leather and the faint scent of pine, clean and earthy, like the air after a storm. As she started the car and pulled back onto the road, the silence between them felt oddly comfortable. For the first time in hours, Daniel allowed himself to breathe. It wasn't much, but it was something. The road stretched out before them, endless and winding. They didn't speak right away, each lost in their own thoughts. Daniel stared out the window, watching the landscape pass by in a blur of green fields and sparse trees. The tension in his chest hadn't quite faded, but it had lessened. He wasn't sure where he was going, but for the first time in a long while, he wasn't as afraid of that uncertainty. The woman, who had yet to introduce herself, glanced at him from time to time, her eyes sharp but not unkind. It was clear she was waiting for him to say something. To open up. But Daniel didn't know where to start. He didn't know how to explain everything that had happened, the anger, the confusion, the heartache. He didn't even know if he could trust this woman. She was a stranger, after all. But there was something in her presence that felt like an anchor, something that made him feel like she could understand. So, she said, breaking the silence. What happened back there? The funeral, I mean. Daniel's throat tightened at the mention of the event. He stared out the window for a moment, gathering his thoughts. How could he explain it? How could he put into words the utter humiliation he had felt when his own family, his stepfamily, had rejected him so cruelly? They kicked me out, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't belong with them. The woman was silent for a moment. Sounds like they never made you feel like you did. Daniel nodded, feeling the familiar sting of their words wash over him again. The coldness of his step-siblings. The rejection. The reminder that he was just the orphan, the outsider. I thought I thought things would be different after he died, Daniel continued, his voice trembling slightly. I thought I might finally have a place. That I'd be accepted. But they just tossed me aside. The woman's eyes softened, and she slowed the car slightly, as though considering her next words carefully. I'm sorry, she said quietly. That's a lot to carry. Daniel looked at her, surprised by her empathy. She didn't offer him empty words of reassurance or sympathy. She didn't tell him it would all get better or that everything happened for a reason. She simply acknowledged his pain. And for some reason, that made all the difference. Thanks, he said, his voice hoarse. I don't know where I fit anymore. The woman nodded, her fingers gripping the steering wheel with an easy strength. I know that feeling. I've been there. Daniel looked at her, his curiosity piqued. What do you mean? She gave him a sideways glance, her lips curling into a faint smile. I've had my share of not belonging. But sometimes, when you're lost, you find something unexpected. There was something in her words that made Daniel sit up straighter. He didn't know if it was the way she spoke, or the way she seemed to carry herself, but she had a certain confidence, a quiet certainty, that made him wonder if she had figured out something he hadn't. Something he needed to learn. What do you mean, something unexpected? He asked, his curiosity breaking through the fog of his own confusion. The woman's smile deepened, but she didn't answer right away. Instead, she drove on, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. For a moment, Daniel thought she wasn't going to say anything more. But then, she spoke again, her voice softer this time. Sometimes, when you're at your lowest, when you've lost everything, you stumble upon things you didn't know you were looking for. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. Was she talking about him? Was she suggesting that there was more to his life than the pain and rejection he had been carrying all this time? I don't know if I believe in that, Daniel said quietly. I don't know if I can believe in anything right now. The woman glanced at him, her eyes steady. I understand. But that doesn't mean you stop looking. Sometimes, the things you need most come when you least expect them. As the car rumbled on through the night, Daniel felt something stir inside him, a spark of hope, fragile but real. For the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe he wasn't as alone as he had thought. The car hummed steadily down the lonely road, the sound of tires against gravel almost meditative. The woman's name was Claire, though she hadn't offered it up freely. Daniel had asked, but her answer had been brief, almost like an afterthought. Claire, she had said, as if it wasn't important, but Daniel knew it was something to her. Maybe that's why she hadn't shared much else about herself. They both seemed to be two people trapped in their own worlds, neither fully willing to let the other in. The journey had been quiet for a while, the kind of silence that wasn't awkward, but instead, laden with understanding, two souls moving in parallel, walking along the same path without speaking too much, but knowing the other was there. The weight of his own grief still loomed large over Daniel, but there was a surprising comfort in being with someone who didn't ask too many questions. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Daniel wasn't overwhelmed by the need to explain himself. He could simply exist in the moment. As the sun finally set, the sky turned a deep navy blue. Claire's car headlights sliced through the dark, but the vast emptiness of the land around them made everything seem even more isolated. Every so often, Daniel would glance out the window, lost in thought, watching the rolling hills that stretched endlessly into the distance. He had no idea where they were heading. Part of him didn't care anymore. What mattered now was getting away from the memory of the funeral, from the way his step-siblings had coldly turned their backs on him, from the bitter taste of rejection that still lingered on his tongue. Do you ever feel like you're running away from something? Daniel asked, his voice breaking the silence, but you don't know where you're going? Claire didn't look at him at first. Her eyes remained fixed on the road ahead. I think we all run from something at some point, she said. Sometimes, we run from pain. Other times, we run from the truth. You might think you're escaping something, but in reality, you're just going somewhere else to face the same battle. Daniel absorbed her words, not sure if he completely understood. There was something in the way she spoke, like she had seen more than her fair share of pain, perhaps even more than he could imagine. It was both comforting and unsettling at the same time. The silence stretched again, but it was no longer the oppressive silence of grief. Instead, it was the silence of two people sharing the same space, not yet ready to expose all their thoughts. After a while, Claire spoke again, her voice thoughtful but soft. "You don't have to tell me everything right now, Daniel. But you should know, whatever happened back there at that funeral, whatever you're running from, it doesn't have to define you." He let her words hang in the air for a moment before responding. "I don't even know who I am anymore. It's like I was just existing for them. My stepfather, my step-siblings, I was just this thing in their life. And when he died, it was like they didn't even care. They just pushed me away." Claire nodded, her face etched with a deep, almost painful empathy. "I know what it's like to feel invisible," she said. "Like you're nothing more than a shadow in someone else's life, there but never really seen. But that's the trick, Daniel. We think we need to be seen by others to matter. But it's not about that. It's about finding your own worth, your own reason for being. You're not defined by anyone else's opinion of you, no matter how much it hurts." Daniel looked out the window again, his mind swirling with her words. It was hard to believe them, not after everything he'd been through, not after the rejection, the coldness, and the bitterness that had followed his stepfather's death. But there was something in Claire's tone, something in her eyes, that made him want to believe her. For a long time, neither of them said anything. The night had fallen completely now, and the stars overhead glittered in the vast sky like distant, forgotten memories. The road was desolate, winding through fields and patches of forest, where nothing but the occasional farmhouse could be seen in the distance. The isolation was comforting, yet it was also suffocating. Daniel had never been this far out of town, and the world around him seemed so foreign now, like it didn't quite belong to him. "Where are we going, exactly?" Daniel finally asked, his curiosity getting the better of him. Claire glanced at him, but there was no sign of hesitation in her response. "I'm taking you to a place where you can think. Where you can be away from the noise, from the expectations, from everything you think you're supposed to be. There's a cabin up ahead, far from everything. No distractions. Just you, me, and the quiet." Daniel wasn't sure what to make of her answer. She hadn't given him any details, just a vague description of where they were headed. But the way she said it, like there was a purpose behind it, made him wonder what kind of place it could be. Why did she feel so certain that this quiet would be the answer? Was there something in the solitude that could give him the clarity he so desperately needed? The journey stretched on, the hours blending together. Daniel didn't know how long they'd been driving, but it felt like they'd been in the car for a lifetime. As they neared their destination, Claire slowed the car down, her headlights casting an eerie glow over the woods ahead. "There it is," she said, her voice steady. Daniel squinted into the dark, but all he could see was a silhouette against the trees, an old wooden cabin, weathered by time. The structure was small, but sturdy-looking, the kind of place you would expect to find in a remote part of the world, far from any civilization. Claire pulled up the driveway, the gravel crunching under the tires. As they came to a stop, Daniel noticed the quiet, an oppressive, almost eerie stillness that surrounded the cabin. No birds, no insects. Just the wind, the trees, and the dark night. "This is it?" Daniel asked, his voice filled with doubt. He had expected something more inviting. Something warmer. But instead, the cabin looked abandoned, like something out of a horror story. Claire smiled slightly, as if she could read his thoughts. "It's not much. But sometimes, the most uncomfortable places are the ones that give you the most clarity." Daniel hesitated, unsure whether to trust her. But something inside him, something deep and instinctual, told him to go along with it. He needed something. He needed time to think, time to figure out how to move forward. "I'll go in," Daniel said finally, his voice steady despite the unease creeping up his spine. Claire nodded, her gaze sharp but kind. "Good. You can stay as long as you need." She didn't say anything more as Daniel opened the door and stepped out of the car. The night air hit him like a cold slap, but the quiet was oddly soothing. He looked up at the cabin again, the dim light from the headlights illuminating its weathered exterior. With one last glance at Claire, Daniel walked toward the door. He didn't know what awaited him inside, but he knew that whatever it was, it would be different from what he'd known before. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what he needed. The wooden floorboards creaked under Daniel's feet as he stepped inside the cabin, the only sound in the otherwise deafening silence. His breath caught slightly in his throat as the door swung shut behind him, cutting him off from the world outside. The cabin was small, rustic, but cozy in its own way. A single light bulb hung from the low ceiling, casting a soft yellow glow across the room. The walls were lined with bookshelves, some sagging under the weight of old novels, dusty trinkets, and photographs that seemed to tell stories of lives long past. Despite the warmth of the room, there was a coldness in Daniel's chest that wouldn't go away. The hum of his own thoughts, the same thoughts that had plagued him ever since his stepfather's funeral, buzzed relentlessly in his mind. Rejection. Loss. The suffocating feeling of being an outsider, unwanted by the very family he had clung to for years. "Make yourself at home," Claire's voice cut through his thoughts as she entered behind him, her footsteps light but purposeful. She hadn't followed him inside immediately, she had allowed him his space, which Daniel appreciated more than he cared to admit. The cabin wasn't much, just a few pieces of old furniture, a small, worn sofa in the corner, a wooden table with mismatched chairs, and a fireplace that hadn't been lit in some time. There was something incredibly intimate about the space, almost as though it had been frozen in time. It was the kind of place where people went to disappear, to escape from the world for a while, and Daniel had to admit, it felt a little like a sanctuary. He ran a hand through his hair, still unsure of what to make of the situation. There were so many things he wanted to say, so many questions he wanted to ask Claire, but the words felt stuck in his throat. He had always been someone who found solace in words, whether through journaling or talking things through with others, but right now, even his thoughts felt like a tangled mess. Everything about the day had felt like a blur. The funeral, the coldness of his stepfamily, Claire's unexpected appearance, everything was happening too quickly, too much for him to process. "Do you need anything?" Claire asked, her voice soft but steady as she surveyed the room. She was offering him space, but also subtly urging him to take what he needed from the environment. Daniel shook his head. "I'm fine." It wasn't true. He wasn't fine. He hadn't been fine in a long time. But he didn't know how to say that. Instead, he sat down on the worn sofa, the cushions sagging under his weight. His eyes wandered over to the small wood-burning stove in the corner, its faint, ashy smell mixing with the dust in the air. He watched as the firelight flickered, casting fleeting shadows across the room. It wasn't a grand scene, but it felt peaceful in a way he wasn't used to. "I don't know what to do anymore," Daniel said finally, his voice almost a whisper. He hadn't meant to speak it out loud, but the words tumbled out before he could stop them. It was as if something inside him had finally cracked, letting the truth spill out into the open. Claire was silent for a moment, taking a slow breath, before she settled herself in the chair across from him. Her gaze was steady but compassionate. Never judgmental. It was clear she was waiting for him to continue, but she didn't push. She knew that sometimes, the space to speak was more important than the actual words. "I've always tried to do the right thing," Daniel went on, his voice shaky now. "I tried to be the good son, the good stepson. I thought if I could just prove myself, if I could be good enough, then maybe they would accept me. But it didn't work. It never worked." Claire leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, her gaze unwavering. Why did you think you needed their acceptance? She asked gently. Daniel blinked, caught off guard by the question. What do you mean? I mean, Claire said, her voice quiet but sharp, why did you think you had to earn their love? Their approval? Why not just love yourself first? Daniel shook his head, the question landing on him like a ton of bricks. It was something he had never considered, not really. I don't know, he muttered. I guess, because I didn't have anyone else. My real parents, they're gone, and I was just left with them. With my stepfather and his kids. They were all I had, so I thought if I tried hard enough, I could make it work. I thought I could be part of the family. Claire nodded slowly, her expression sympathetic but knowing. You're not the only one who feels that way, you know. A lot of people grow up believing that their worth is tied to how others see them. But the truth is, their opinion of you doesn't define who you are. You're enough as you are, Daniel. You don't need their approval to be worthy. He didn't respond right away, her words hanging in the air between them like a delicate thread. He wanted to believe her, but the wounds of rejection were still too fresh, the pain still too raw. He had spent so many years trying to prove himself, trying to earn his place in a family that had never truly accepted him. How could he let go of that now? The silence stretched, the weight of his thoughts pressing in on him. He could feel the tension in his chest again, the sense of being trapped in a never-ending cycle of self-doubt and pain. For a brief moment, he considered leaving, just walking away from the cabin, from Claire, from all of it, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the quiet, or the strange sense of safety that had come over him in this strange place. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the fact that for the first time in what felt like years, someone was actually listening. No judgment. No expectations. Just someone willing to hear him out. I don't know how to stop feeling like this, Daniel said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Claire studied him, her gaze soft but intense. You start by giving yourself permission to heal. To be angry. To be sad. To grieve. You're allowed to feel all of it, Daniel. But you can't let it control you. You can't keep living in the past. It's not easy, and it doesn't happen overnight, but you have to choose to take the first step. Her words were like a light cutting through the darkness inside him, a gentle push towards something he hadn't allowed himself to consider. Healing. Maybe it wasn't about forgetting the past, about erasing the hurt, but about choosing to move forward in spite of it. It felt like the tiniest spark of hope had ignited inside him, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to acknowledge it. Why are you helping me? Daniel asked, his voice filled with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. He still didn't understand why Claire had gone out of her way to help him, someone she barely knew. It didn't make sense. Claire met his gaze and smiled softly. I've been where you are, she said quietly. I know what it's like to feel lost, to feel like you've got nothing left. But I also know that there's always a way forward. It doesn't matter how long it takes. You can't stay stuck forever. Daniel was silent for a moment, processing her words. Then, for the first time in a long time, a small smile tugged at the corners of his lips. It was barely there, but it was real. He wasn't sure where the road ahead would lead, but for the first time, he didn't feel completely alone. Thank you, he said simply, his voice steady but filled with gratitude. Claire nodded, standing up slowly. You don't need to thank me. Just take the time you need, Daniel. Think. Reflect. And when you're ready, we'll talk about what comes next. But remember, whatever happens, you don't have to do this alone. Daniel watched as she moved toward the small kitchenette in the corner, her movements calm and sure. For a moment, he just sat there, letting the silence settle over him again. But this time, it wasn't the oppressive silence of grief. It was the kind of quiet that held possibility, that left space for healing. And as he sat there in the warmth of the cabin, he allowed himself to hope. To believe that maybe, just maybe, he could find his way out of the darkness. The early morning light filtered softly through the windows of the cabin, casting long, gentle shadows on the wooden floor. Daniel lay on the couch, staring up at the ceiling, his mind racing. He hadn't slept much, his thoughts kept him awake, moving like restless waves. Last night had been a turning point, an unexpected revelation that had left him with more questions than answers, but it had also opened a door. The door to something he hadn't thought he'd ever find again: hope. The fire that had crackled in the hearth last night had burned low, and the warmth of the room no longer felt as comforting. Instead, the air felt thick with the weight of everything Daniel had been trying to ignore. The journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. He glanced over at the small kitchen area, where Claire was quietly preparing coffee. There was a quiet rhythm to her movements, a peace in the way she moved around the room. She didn't ask questions, didn't prod, but Daniel knew she was waiting for him to make the next move. She was patient, and that patience was something he both admired and feared. Daniel sat up, his legs swinging over the edge of the sofa, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he felt the overwhelming need to talk. He had to do it. He had to get it all out. He stood up slowly, stretching the stiffness from his body as he walked toward the kitchen. Claire turned slightly, sensing his movement, and her eyes met his, steady but encouraging. "I think I'm ready to talk," Daniel said, his voice rough from the lack of sleep but filled with a sense of purpose. Claire nodded without a word, her expression calm but attentive. She handed him a cup of coffee without asking if he wanted it. It was just there, as if she already knew. "I don't know where to begin," Daniel muttered, taking the cup from her and cradling it in his hands. The warmth of the mug seeped into his fingers, grounding him. I guess I have to face it all. The things I've been running from. The things I've been pretending didn't matter." Claire stayed quiet, letting the weight of his words settle. She didn't rush him. She simply waited. "I've spent so many years trying to please people who never really cared about me," Daniel continued, the words coming easier now. He wasn't sure if it was the solitude or the kindness Claire had shown him, but something inside him was starting to break open, letting out all the pain he had locked away. "I wanted my stepfather's approval so badly, but it was never about me. It was about what I could do for him, what I could be for him. His children, my step-siblings, they never saw me as anything other than a burden. And when he died, it felt like everything just vanished." He paused, swallowing hard, the tightness in his throat almost choking him. The bitterness that had consumed him for so long was beginning to surface. "I thought that if I could just prove I was worth something, if I could prove I was family, then maybe I wouldn't feel so alone. But I was wrong. They never saw me as family. I was just an outsider. And when my stepfather died, they kicked me out of the funeral. Just like that. Like I was nothing. It crushed me, Claire. I've never felt more unwanted in my life." Claire listened intently, her gaze unwavering. She didn't interrupt. She didn't offer advice. She just listened, allowing Daniel to speak the truth that had been buried for so long. "The thing is," Daniel went on, his voice cracking now, "I thought that if I could just get through that, if I could just get away from them, I'd be okay. But I'm not okay. And I'm tired of pretending I am. I'm tired of carrying around this weight, this idea that I'm not good enough, that I'll never be enough for anyone." A tear slipped down his cheek, but Daniel wiped it away quickly, embarrassed by his vulnerability. He hadn't meant to cry, but the release was undeniable. After all these years of keeping everything inside, it was finally coming out. Claire didn't flinch at the sight of his tears. Instead, she stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You've been carrying that weight for too long, Daniel," she said softly. "And I think you're starting to see it. You're not running from the past anymore. You're starting to face it." Daniel let out a deep breath, feeling the rawness of his emotions. "I don't know if I can ever really let go of what happened. The way they treated me. It still hurts, Claire. I don't know how to move forward from that. You don't have to let go all at once, Claire replied, her voice calm. Healing takes time. And forgiveness, it's not for them. It's for you. It's about letting go of the power they have over you. You've been holding on to their rejection like it's part of your identity, but it doesn't define you. It never did. You are not what they made you feel like. You are your own person. And that's what you need to realize. Her words were like a balm to the wound Daniel had been carrying for so long. They weren't easy to hear, but they were what he needed. The pain didn't have to define him. It didn't have to hold him captive forever. He had the power to choose how he moved forward. But how? Daniel whispered, the doubt creeping in. How do I let go of all of it? How do I move past this pain when it's been with me for so long? Claire smiled gently, her eyes full of understanding. You take it one step at a time. You allow yourself to feel the pain. You acknowledge it. And then you let it go. You make room for something better. It won't be easy, but you've already taken the hardest step, you've started facing it. For a moment, the room was silent. Daniel's mind raced as he absorbed her words. It was hard to imagine a life where he wasn't bound by the chains of his past, where he wasn't constantly trying to prove himself, constantly seeking validation from those who had never truly seen him. But maybe that life was possible. Maybe it wasn't about seeking approval from others. Maybe it was about learning to approve of himself. Maybe it was about finding peace in the quiet and learning to trust in his own worth. He met Claire's gaze, and for the first time in a long time, he saw something different in her eyes. Not just sympathy. Not just kindness. But strength. A quiet strength that told him he wasn't alone in this. She had been through her own battles, her own struggles. And now, she was here, guiding him through his. I'm scared, Claire, Daniel said, his voice small but honest. Scared that I'll never be enough. Scared that I'll always be that kid, rejected and forgotten. Claire squeezed his shoulder, her touch firm and reassuring. You already are enough, Daniel. Don't let anyone make you feel like you're not. Not even yourself. Daniel took a deep breath, letting the words sink in. For the first time in years, he felt a shift inside him. It wasn't an immediate change, it wasn't like the world suddenly became perfect or all the pain vanished. But it was a beginning. A quiet, hopeful beginning. I don't know what the future holds, Daniel said slowly, but I think I want to try to find out. I want to see if I can be something different. For myself. Claire smiled, her expression warm. That's all anyone can do. Just take it one day at a time. Daniel nodded, feeling the weight on his shoulders start to lift. It wasn't gone, not entirely. But it was lighter. The path ahead wasn't clear, but he no longer felt completely lost. There was hope now. A small, fragile hope. And that was enough to keep him going. The morning passed slowly as Daniel and Claire sat together, talking and reflecting. It wasn't an easy conversation, but it was necessary. Each word that was spoken, each revelation that was made, felt like another step toward understanding. Later that afternoon, Claire stood up from the table, her eyes thoughtful. There's one more thing I want to show you, she said. It's something that might help you understand your next step. Daniel stood as well, intrigued. What is it? You'll see, Claire said with a smile. Come with me.